Hello, this is David Mitchell. Some folk left comments on my earlier video disagreeing with my view that the biblical Jubilee was a 49-year cycle. They say the Jubilee was a 50-year cycle. Now this has actually been debated for centuries, and to be honest, the biblical evidence can be hard to interpret. The Jubilee legislation does speak of sanctifying the 50th year for the Jubilee. But there is one key insight that is often missed in this discussion, and when we discover it, we'll see that the Bible really does speak of a 49-year Jubilee cycle. But first, let's get a bit of background. Judaism doesn't observe the Jubilee. If it did, it would follow the teaching of the 12th century Rabbi Moses Maimonides, or Rambam. And Rambam said the Jubilee is a 50-year cycle. He said, the Jubilee year is not counted in the set of sabbatical years. Instead, the 49th year is a sabbatic year, and the 50th year is a Jubilee year. Then the 51st year is the first of the 6 years of the next sabbatic cycle, and this is true of every Jubilee year. Yet, 1,000 years earlier, in Roman times, the Israelite sages were not at all in agreement about this matter. Some said the Jubilee is not part of the Septenate. That's the same view as Rambam. But other eminent rabbis said the Jubilee was 49 years. So, for instance, Rabbi Judah Bar Ilai said the Jubilee is counted as part of the Septenate. That is, the Jubilee takes place at the same time as the 7th year of the sabbatic cycle, making a 49-year cycle. And Rabbi Judah Hanassi had another theory. He said the 50th year is reckoned both ways, and he meant that the Jubilee cycle was counted in the first year of the next sabbatic cycle, again making a 49-year cycle. So in Roman times, the rabbis differed. Some said the Jubilee was a 50-year cycle, but other very prominent teachers said it was a 49-year cycle. But if we go back even earlier, before Roman times, we find that all the early evidence unanimously supports the 49-year Jubilee. And this evidence is both textual and practical. Let's start with the Book of Jubilees. It was written well before the 1st century BC. And it counts off the history of the world from creation to the Exodus in 49-year Jubilees throughout. For instance, it numbers the 127 years of Sarah's life as 2 Jubilees, 4 heptads, and 1 year, making 127 years. And the Book of Daniel from the 6th century BC supports the same idea. Gabriel's heavenly year count of 77s, or 490 years, is not a random number. It is 10 49-year Jubilees. As Wacholder said, although the Book of Daniel never mentions the term directly, the Jubilee forms the essence of Daniel 9:24-27. 2 Chronicles 36:21 also counts history in 49-year Jubilees, for the land is to enjoy 70 years of Sabbaths to compensate for 70 unkept sabbatic years. But there seems to be no penalty for unkept Jubilee years, so it follows that the sabbatic and Jubilee year must overlap. And what's more, the 70 sabbatic years equal 10 Jubilees, or 490 years, which is the same distance in the past as Gabriel tells Daniel that must unfold until the Messiah comes. And we also know that the Samaritans, who kept their own calendrical traditions, quite separate from the rabbinic Jews, historically observed a 49-year Jubilee. And again, there is a simple fact that the Bible speaks of observing the Shemitah, the sabbatic year, every 7 years, but it does not speak of an extra intercalated year for the Jubilee. So if the sabbatic cycle were continuously observed without intercalation every 7 years, and the Jubilee added on, then the sabbatic cycle would fall out of synchronization with the Jubilee. But that cannot be, for the Jubilee must come at the end of every 7 sabbatic years. So there must be a way for the Jubilee to come at the end of every 7 sabbatic years without adding an extra year. And finally, quite apart from the textual evidence, there is the practical issue that 2 consecutive fallow years would have been unbearable for an agrarian society. Observing the 1-year sabbatic fallow was hard for the Israelites. It often led to shortage, sometimes famine. Wars were lost because of it. A double fallow year would have been much harder. It is hard to see how any agricultural society could survive a double fallow year. Nor is there any suggestion in the Bible that a double fallow year was ever required. So all the evidence points to ancient Israel observing a 49-year Jubilee cycle. So we have to conclude that the 7th Shemitah year and the Jubilee year in some way coincided. But how did they coincide? And this is where we come to the key insight that I spoke of at the beginning. And for this we must turn to Ezekiel chapter 40 and verse 1. Here it is in my own translation. I've put the Hebrew beside it in transliteration so you can check. And we read, "In the 25th year of our exile, at Rosh Hashanah, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was struck down, on that very day the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me there," to Jerusalem. But why does Ezekiel say it was Rosh Hashanah on the 10th of the month? Surely Rosh Hashanah should fall on the 1st of Tishri, not the 10th. The 10th of Tishri is Yom Kippur. It says so in Leviticus 23. So what is going on here? Well, what is going on is that Rosh Hashanah falls on the 10th of the month only in a Jubilee year. So in a Jubilee year, Rosh Hashanah does fall on Yom Kippur. That is taught clearly in the Jubilee legislation in Leviticus 25. It says, "You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the days of the 7 weeks of years shall be for you 49 years. And then you shall sound the shofar of fanfare on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of the atonements, on Yom HaKippurim, you shall sound the shofar throughout all your land, and you shall sanctify the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. A jubilee it shall be for you, and each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. A jubilee shall that 50th year be for you." And the same thing is confirmed in Seder Olam Rabbah, chapter 11. It says, "In the 25th year of our exile, on Rosh Hashanah," when was it said to him? At the beginning of the Jubilee. And Rashi says the same thing. He says, "What kind of year is this whose Rosh Hashanah falls on the 10th of the month?" The answer is that this is the Jubilee year. So Rosh Hashanah falls on the 10th day of the month only at the beginning of a Jubilee year. And although this takes place in the 49th year of the Shemitah cycle, Leviticus 25:11 calls it the 50th year. So, here is the true solution of the overlap of the Sabbatic and Jubilee year. On 1st Tishri of the 49th year, they consecrated the 7th Sabbatic year, and the Sabbatic obligations came into force. The fallow year, the remission of debts, the public Torah reading, and the manumission of bondservants. And then, 9 days later, on 10th of Tishri, they proclaimed the Jubilee year on Yom Kippur, and the Jubilee obligations of the return of property were begun and finally enacted at the end of the Jubilee year. Therefore, in Tishri of the 49th year of the Sabbatic cycle, the first 9 days belong to the Sabbatic year alone. Then, from the 10th of the month onward, The rest of that agrarian year, now called the 50th year, was both sabbatic year and Jubilee, in which property was restored to its ancestral clans. In other words, they had 2 new years in 10 days. So that's the solution. Ancient Israel did indeed celebrate a 49-year Jubilee cycle, not a 50-year cycle. The idea of the 50-year cycle arose among the Pharisees in Roman times. The Pharisees made a lot of changes to the ancient calendar. But the true biblical Jubilee cycle is the 49-year one. Now, this is more important than it may seem at first, for knowing the true Jubilee cycle allows us to fine-tune many dates of biblical chronology. What's more, it allows us to calculate the date of Adam's creation, and what is even more, it allows us to calculate the times of the end of the age. And if you want to know more about that, then you might be interested in this book, Awaiting the Millennial Kingdom. Amen. Blessed be Jesus the Messiah. Amen.